I am just, for me, I'm just trying to be as authentic and real as possible while still projecting an image. It's a difficult tightrope, and I don't always get it right.
Welcome to the Recaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on a bit old school games. Today, I'm going to be sitting down with James Desborough, better known as Grim Jim, and we're going to talk about creating games, the difference between the UK and North American gaming scene, online tabletop role-playing spaces, just a whole bunch more. It was a really fun conversation. I know for some folks, James is a very divisive character, and I've actually had people try to warn me off from speaking with him or giving him a platform. Please don't do that. I find that really bad. But I hope that people will listen to this chat and find something in it that they can relate to, even if it's really, really small. Way too often in the online world, people get labeled and then everybody just assumes that label is all that there is to that person. And it's almost dehumanizing. I think that most of us, especially in this nerdy space that we all enjoy, are much more alike than we are different. And if we stop focusing on those differences, we'll find things that, makes everything a lot more fun and more happy to be around. So before we get to that interview, though, I've got a very rare ad I want to play. Don't worry, not trying to sell you anything. It's just some more ear candy and a suggestion for another listen. So I'm going to play that first, and then we'll jump right to the interview. And as always, I hope you can sit back, listen, and enjoy.
Are you looking for a D&D podcast with a dark side? Something more like Game of Thrones and less like Monty Python? Tale of the Manticore is part dark fantasy audio drama, part solo D&D RPG. There's no plot armor here. The dice make all the important decisions. Join me as I resurrect the excitement, wonder, and emotion of old school D&D. Made for a mature audience, Tale of the Manticore is both a fiction and a game. It's the story where chaos rolls.
All right, folks, I am joined by James Grim Jim. Which do you prefer, Grim, Jim, or James? Which should I refer to you as?
Any of them, but Grim's what most people call me by.
All right. I think most people that end up listening to this will have heard of your name before, but on some chance that somebody hasn't, you have been in the tabletop space for decades and have a huge amount of titles under your belt. If you had to guess or estimate, how many different titles and products do you think you've been working on over the years?
Last time I checked, it was over 100 that I'd participated in or had some hand in the development of or had written outright. So yeah, a lot of stuff. Slowed down a bit recently.
If tomorrow you're going to stop, if you're like, I've had enough of this, I'm going to go off, retire in a nice cabin, and nobody was going to see any more products produced by me. What's your put it up on the pedestal? This is my pedestal product, and which one would be like throw it in the fireplace? Don't ever talk about it. I wish my name wasn't on it.
That's difficult.
Pick your favorite and least favorite child. Go.
Yeah, it might actually be the same product. So I wrote the Cannibal Sector 1 source book for SLA Industries. And was pretty tight with the people involved at the time. And what I submitted, I felt was really good. I felt it would have been in contention for an Origins Award or something for the second time. However, I feel that it was edited and mishandled so badly that what I handed in, while still it came out good, it felt like a lot of what I was going for didn't come through. So yeah, probably that.
So you've worked with a bunch of different companies that most people would have heard of. You've worked with Wizards, you've worked with Steve Jackson, Mongoose, a bunch of others. Over time, ignoring what may have happened in the years since you worked with them, but at the time, what was it like working with those companies? Which ones were really easy to collaborate with? Which ones were more difficult? Like how did that collaboration work, especially with some of them? Like I would assume with Steve Jackson, where you're crossing a big time gap between the two of you back in that time period as well.
Well, yeah. When I worked with Steve Jackson, like early internet. That was dial up to get your email and then hang up because you're getting charged money. So that's what things were like then. So yeah, that was difficult. You could go days or even a week without getting a reply back on something, and you just had to carry on working on. But it also meant there wasn't much in the way of actual personal contact between us working on the project and them overseeing it. So that was a bit weird. When I worked for Wizards, things were a bit more developed. But that was tricky as well. They just kind of seemed to grab a whole bunch of freelancers and throw them at a project and expect us to kind of fight it out amongst ourselves over who was doing which section and how it all went together. So that was an odd experience. With people like Mongoose, I mean, I'd met them at conventions and so on, and so it was a lot more personable, I think, with the British companies, obviously, because they're here.
Yeah, you can see them face to face. What as you go through a process, regardless of what project it is, what do you think is the hardest thing to actually get you moving on it? Like to get that first step into, you have some sort of an idea, and to get the first few words written down. What's the process like for you on
that? Picking which one, I think, is the biggest problem, because you have all these sort of competing sort of pulls on you. Like, do I want to do the project that I find the most personally satisfying, or do I need to do something that's more commercial this time? Do I want to tie in this system that's flavor of the month, or do I want to tie into something else? What's the best one for the game? My problem is generally I have too many ideas and then I can't settle on one, or I do settle on one and then no, I'd rather be doing something else. So that's that's the main problem for me.
That push and pull between what's popular, what will be commercially viable, versus, hey, this is something I actually think would be really cool to do. I guess because this is now your full-time thing, right? Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, so it has been since about 2005.
So that makes it a lot more important for you to nail that decision than somebody who's doing it as a hobby or a side hustle. But how do you make that call? Like, how do you keep it so that you're being able to stay sane producing stuff, because you're producing something that you like, but also understanding that, hey, this sort of stuff sells, so I got to go that route?
Yeah, well, usually what I do is I'll have two projects on the go at the same time. So one that's more work, and one that's more like a passion project or something. Because if you can chop and change between the two, yeah, a change is as good as a rest. So it kind of keeps you fresh, keeps you motivated a bit more. So that's how.
Between the stuff that you publish and the large number of videos that you've done of reviews of other people's games, and I'm sure you get stuff just sent to you, like, just to look at or comment on, how do you keep the mechanic soup that must be in your head straight between different things, and not even counting all the games that you're running as well? So how are you able to sit down and go, oh yeah, this is how this game does this, or this is how this product does this, and not constantly have to be referencing a book?
It used to be easier for me. I think I'm slowing down as I'm getting older. I used to be able to pick up a book in the afternoon and run a game in the evening. It was, just, I don't know, it's the way my brain's wired for whatever reason. Which is weird, because I'm not like hugely into maths or anything otherwise. It's just game systems I seem to have a fairly intuitive grasp of for some reason. I don't tend to have a problem differentiating between different games. What trips me up the most is editions of the same game. So there's some folder in my brain marked Dungeons and Dragons, but in that all the different editions are in a kind of hodgepodge. So whatever edition I'm actually running or playing, it does trip me up. Like, I'm expecting the skill to have a different title, or to run a different way, or a spell to have a different way of being enacted. then is correct. Fortunately, with D&D, at least, there's so much material on the net, you can quickly Google and make sure you've got the right interpretation. For the others, I think most games have a fairly distinct system. And once you've grasped what's at the core, is it a dice pool? Is it roll take the highest? Is it whatever? Everything else kind of falls into place as long as you understand that core segment right at the center.
If you had to look over the most common mechanics, whether it be a D20 roll high, D100, dice pools, what of over the last several decades of this, what has become in your head probably the most elegant way of handling it? Is it still a D20, or is it more of a D100, or where do you think is the most elegant for a general purpose? I know every game is slightly different, but generally speaking.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because I tend to be a system matters kind of guy. So you need to marry the right system to the right background and whatever it is you're going for. Generally speaking, I quite like dice pool systems because you have that visceral feel of how good your character is at something. Am I picking up, a big fistful of dice, or is it just a couple? And, that gives you an immediate sort of tangible grasp on how good your character is. The drawback is that the dice pool systems don't tend to be particularly granular. So if you're going for something hard science fiction, or you're trying to model realism in any way, then they're not so good. But I do like the variable number of successes you can get, things like that, to gauge how well you succeed at a task, not just whether you do.
When people say they're making a game, what constitutes a game versus I had an adventure and I tacked a system onto it? Because there's a lot of games that come out where I feel the person didn't want to develop a game system. They wanted to explore a theme or an adventure idea that they had, and then to make that work, they came up with some new mechanics and put it on there. But there was never any intention for that game to be played in any other sort of an adventure. Really, it was a game that was made to support that particular thing. Is that still a RPG game, or is that an adventure that happens to have extra mechanics? How do you view it?
I would say it is a game, but it's singular, and it's missing out on some of the major things that make RPGs so appealing. That you can go on and you can do other adventures, that you can, explore the boundaries and do anything. So it's on one sort of extreme end. If you've got sandbox at one end and like a choose your own adventure on the other, then things like Lady Blackbird or whatever, they're closer to the fighting fantasy books. You can play them multiple times, but once you've played it once, you kind of know
right
how it works. And they're often so specific that you can't spin them off into a more generalized game.
So if anybody who doesn't know who you are, by this point, having listened and heard a couple of things on here, clearly know that you're British.
Yes.
A British Euro version of gaming has got to differ quite greatly from an American / in my case, Canadian view of gaming, simply due to what was popular when we were children coming up, or what your first exposures might be to a game. And I've heard you mention before in the past of D&D wasn't your first game. That isn't what you came up on. The general vibe of the communities around gaming, though, between the two different groups, if we'll call it that, how do you see it having evolved up till now? Has it become more hodgepodge, where the differences between, say, a North American view versus a Euro view have become closer, or is it there's still some fundamentals that both sides aren't really seeing each other properly on how gaming overall is viewed?
Yeah, I think that second idea is probably closer to it. I do think we're a lot closer than we used to be, because lots of people are playing internationally online and so on. I mean, you see that in all forms of life. Slang is much more mobile now than it used to be. You don't get quite so many confused looks from people when you use certain slang words, or even Cockney rhyming slang or whatever else. But I think there is still a difference in the cultures, just as you can say that there is a difference in the overall culture between the countries. Quite what that is has become harder and harder to pin down. And then continental Europe has its own style as well, and even then, Germany is different to France. I used to be involved in like International Vampire LARP Society, and trying to get different gaming cultures from different countries to see eye to eye was always a bit of an issue for us.
Yeah, and I think that for folks that are in the US, I think they could probably appreciate that a little bit if they go back and they read the history on D&D, and just seeing the differences in how the game was played, in its bedroom in the Midwest versus how it was played on either coast. There was quite a big difference there, and geographically, that's probably about the same distances you've got between, say the UK versus France versus Germany. So probably even greater distance, to be honest. Because there's of those differences, what do you see as of how the different games come out of each side? What is somebody who grew up like you did in the UK? What are they valuing more in a game versus what somebody in, say, America is valuing it? Both from somebody of yours and my generation versus people who are coming into it now, I guess maybe is a good way of delineating it as well. If you were a gamer in the 80s, 90s, so on, versus if you only started in the 2010s, what do you value differently?
That's tricky. I mean, older British gamers, lots of us have not been game monogamists. So yeah, it's not just D&D all the time. But then I saw when Satine Phoenix was still popular, I joined her on sort of a leg of her visit to Europe when she went round some game stores and things in London, doing appearances and meetups and things. And that crowd was all 5e, and they were very, very different to the older British gamers, who I felt, I mean, coming up with the influences and that's with things like, Warhammer is a great expression of British gaming. It still, even now, has its tongue in its cheek a little bit. If you look at Orcs or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, things like that. We're also very aware of like the really weird mix of mythical heritage that we have in this country, because you've got Celtic, Norse, you've got Roman, you've got Norse, you've got Anglo-Saxon, Pictish, some continental saints and things in some places, the whole King Arthur thing. So we've always been a bit of a hodgepodge, and we've always had a kind of dark sense of humor to what we do. And this new crowd, I don't think, has as much of that. It's a much more Americanized theater kid sort of group. That is a difference I have noticed between the different sides of the Atlantic. American gamers always seem to be a bit more mainstream culture. I know that's probably sound weird, but compared to over here, where it was always much more rooted in the kind of English literature, theater kids sort of set.
I've seen similar, just in the humor that can happen at a table, where if I'm playing with folks from the US or Canada, you'll hear a lot more pop culture jokes, people working in references from the show they saw that week. Whereas with some of my folks that I've played with, even from Australia, but from outside of America, they seem to lean more into the mythology or the history more so than that way. Because the humor comes off differently as well, just between that. And I don't know if that's a nature of just a generation thing, or if that's just because one side is more seeped in constant pop culture than the other side is, or not?
Well, the classic thing is Monty Python, right? Everyone quotes Holy Grail at the table. That's on both sides of the Atlantic. But Monty Python was always actually quite intelligent humor underneath all the zaniness and wackiness. You know, I think we appreciate that kind of wry tweak to that humor, and Blackadder, I think, is another huge influence on British gaming, because that was a historical comedy set in a somewhat realistic view of the past, and so I think that all becomes part of it, I think.
So with creating your own games, the indie game movement, and then eventually, as it started everything started getting called the OSR movement at some point. between all through there, the tools have changed, the methods of monetizing have changed, and the ease of getting into it has definitely changed over time. But has there been anything outside of like just how easy it is to put something out and publish it that you think has kind of made it much more monetized? Because when I look at it, there was a point in time where if I had a cool idea, I could just go and share it on a forum or share it on a news group. And I was happy just to do that because I'd get feedback and what have you. And now it seems anytime there's an idea, there has to be a Kickstarter behind it.
Yeah.
What do you think drove that change? Is it just the ease and the fact that people do see that there's now a way to monetize it, or?
Partially that. I also think everyone's hobbies are monetized now. So it's not so much a hobby anymore. It's usually a side hustle, whether you knit or you paint or you write game material or whatever it is. There's this immense pressure on everyone to make your time worth money. That's probably more of a sort of Anglo-American sort of cultural thing. But you do see it elsewhere. Yeah, there's just this enormous pressure to make whatever you do be worth something, to spend your time profitably. And yeah, there is such a low barrier to publishing that it's now within everyone's grasp. When I finally went full time, PDFs were only sort of just being a thing, really. And I was fortunate to get in on the sort of early days of that. Kickstarter's crowdfunding, I mean, that's not what it was supposed to be or what it used to be anymore. It used to be meant for small companies to have access to the funding and the support that big companies did. Now big companies are using it as a pre-order service, and that creates an enormous amount of expectation on small companies, which they often can't necessarily meet. And then there's enormous blowback, which often isn't deserved. So but then you got things like Patreon, and there are people churning out things like RPG maps and so on for a small subscription. Yeah, I don't begrudge anyone any of it, but there's also so much dross out there now because everyone publishes everything. And how are you supposed to curate that? I guess that's part of why I've turned to doing reviews so much.
Yeah, the curation and signal to noise ratio and just being able to discover something. I guess it's the same thing with anything. Once it becomes easy to do, everybody puts out stuff. So, like you look at the value of something like YouTube at this point. Thank God that it's as good of it's connected to as good of a search engine as it is, because you'd never find anything because there's so much material being put out every moment of every day. But yeah, how does one? If somebody was just a casual, if they're not somebody who's listening to this podcast, who's probably obviously invested into this space, but if you were just a casual person, you're like, hey, I'd like to find a cool game. Where should they even start looking? Because like,
I mean, that's so difficult. It's so hard to get noticed. So it's really hard. I think that's also part of what's driven people to crowdfunding. Because if you run a crowdfunding campaign, it generates a certain amount of buzz for itself. Especially if it takes off, it becomes kind of self-sustaining. So I think that's part of it. Word of mouth is still probably the most cost-effective way to be noticed. I personally haven't found that paying for advertising on social media has been particularly helpful. Some people have had more success with it. But I've never wanted to get to that point of being obnoxious. And sort of, I'm a bad businessman, but yeah,
I kind of like, I don't monetize anything I do. Mine's all just out there, but I even feel guilty whenever I'm posting onto a couple of people's discords, like, hey, I put up a new episode of the podcast. Just, I kind of feel like that whole, like, oh, I'm annoying people by doing it. But I get where you're coming from with that. It is hard to find how to get your name out there so that people can see it. Because I mean, I'm not monetizing it, but I sure like it whenever people go, "Hey, I heard that, it was awesome." You get that little bit of a, yeah, all right, cool, somebody enjoyed that feeling.
If you can get the attention of someone with a bit of a reputation and an audience, that helps. But then that leads to these kind of weird parasocial relationships, and as someone who keeps getting sent stuff, it causes me to feel a lot of anxiety and guilt because I don't want to put anyone off. But quite often what people send me isn't very good. It's finding a diplomatic way to say, do you sure you want me to review this? I don't think it's ready for prime time, sort of thing. It's a minefield. I've taken the approach that after having previously torched my reputation and all my bridges, that just kind of slowly and steadily building back up a reputation for reviewing things in a fair and even-handed way and being a fair and even-handed guy. I think over the long term, that is probably the best way to build up your reputation, make your links, and create your own sort of ad hoc network.
How do you contrast word of mouth and social interaction with people, say in real life at a convention or at a local game store, or just gaming groups that you stumble upon, versus online? And how are you able to distinguish between the people that you can sit there and have a conversation with and somewhat trust and get along with in one versus the other?
I don't think there's a perfect way to do that. I think you kind of feel your way out and find out who is being authentic. It's a vibes thing, really. I don't draw that much differentiation between online and in person because I live out in the countryside and I always have. And so the internet was always my kind of lifeline since about 1995 to get to know people. It's been my primary social sphere since then, just due to geography. And people are people. The only problem, I don't think that really fundamentally changed until social media really hit. And so you do now have a lot of people being quite inauthentic or signaling a particular ideology or a point of view. And that's their own form of marketing. We've all become products to an extent. We all have a brand that's us. It's not a nice thing, but it's true.
Yeah, I've often said that. So a lot of people will criticize you or folks that you've associated with in the past as being polar or bad actors or what have you. And it seems like it's people taking umbrance with, they'll take one particular topic or one particular phrase or something that's happened and make that person's entire identity. However, there's also people that seem to lean into that, and they're like,
yeah,
where I have a hard time with I'm not going to name anybody's name and try to put them on blast or anything, but I have a hard time at times telling which people actually believe their own hubris, I guess, online of how they're going. Like, is this an act? Are you being a performative person to cater to an audience? And this is for both people on whatever side of a spectrum, or however you define the spectrum of political discourse. Yeah. Are you being genuine, or are you being performative to try to signal to a tribe, or are you actually that way? Because I find, especially in the tabletop space, it swings so far either way so much.
I know flat out that there are some people who perform. They're doing a wrestling sort of heel act, or just dialing up their tendencies and personality to 11. There are other people who aren't so much selling games as they're selling papal indulgences. So, if you buy our game, that will show you support group X or group Y. And that happens on both sides as well. I'm just trying to be as authentic and real as possible while still projecting an image. It's a difficult tightrope, and I don't always get it right. But for me, I think in the long term, if you lie about who you are, whatever you're building, it's on foundations of sand, and sooner or later it's going to come crashing down. Yeah.
In that kind of same sphere, you'll have the common saying that, you'll have one group of people saying, I don't want politics in my game. Another group of people will say, everything is political. And you've always seemed to be a person, anytime I've heard you talk on your own videos, or if you've been with someplace else, that you've been incredibly well spoken and been able to reason through things in a way that you're not making it a political action, but you're able to explain why you think this topic or that topic is applicable or not. Do you think there is when people say they don't want politics in their game, or when I say I don't want it in my game, I'm typically talking about pop politics or something that's happening right now in the real world that I went to the gaming table to not talk about that, because I talk about that when I'm sitting at a coffee shop and I don't want to hear about it anymore. So I go to the gaming table and I play a game in a fantasy world that doesn't have those same problems. Which side is more right on that, do you think? Is it the I don't want politics at my table, or no, of course everything is political?
I think the two sides are kind of talking past each other. Because if you say I don't want politics in my game, the other side of that argument will then bring up an example and say, oh, but what about this? It's full of politics. I mean, in computer games, they will often bring up Metal Gear Solid or whatever. And then they're missing the point. And like I said, they're talking past each other. What it is that people object to is being propagandized to, I think, for the most part. You don't want your message shoved down their throat. And as a designer, as a writer, as an artist, to me, if you're producing propaganda, you're not producing art. You can still have your message, but you should try and accomplish that end through subtext and suggestion. In comics, people often bring up the X-Men, and it's a kind of parable for the civil rights movement. Magneto is Malcolm X, Xavier is Dr. King, right? But it used subtexts and allegory. It used mutants as a stand-in for any mistreated group you wanted to talk about. And it got its message across really effectively by doing that, because people could look at that and say, oh, the way mutants are treated is bad. We shouldn't do that. And then they can apply it in their own lives. But it wasn't bashing you over the head with, this is about civil rights, this is about gay rights, this is about whatever. It created the allegory and allowed it, room to breathe and to people to take their own understanding of it. And to say everything is politics is true in a really kind of facile surface sort of level, in that everything is situated within a political milieu, and we have the way we've been brought up and the assumptions that our parents have imparted to us or that we've rebelled against. I mean, but it doesn't mean anything, because if everything's political, nothing's political, and people are just meaning two different things by the term political. So we don't get any progress.
Yeah, I think it's a difference between one side that really likes to treat everything as if they're in a poli-sci class and are breaking down. It seems like they would be the same people that would take, the whatever the best-selling novel is of today, and break down every thought that the author had on it.
Yeah.
Versus the person who went, oh, that was a really cool book, this cool thing happened, and then they move on with their day.
Yeah. The curtains were blue is what the author meant. Yeah. Like that meme. I mean, I am actually quite political in my real life. I'm fairly extreme on my politics. I'm a left anarchist, but I draw a line between that and my playtime to an extent. I'm sure it influences some of the things I write and the outlook that comes through in them, but part of the fundamental beliefs that I see in anarchism is people's general right to be as free as possible. And so that means people I disagree with should be free to express themselves as well. But there seems to be very little of that same charity in general in either armed camp that are staring at each other. So
yeah, it's an
me in the middle.
thing. I think you're right that it's really amped up over the time of social media. Because if I look back just in the online space, so if we go from BBS boards to, forums and IRC and the various places that we all gathered, up through forums and G Plus, and now it's social media platforms and Discord. If you could go and taking the best and the worst from all of these, what would be your ideal central town square for us to all meet and talk in? What is the what is the features that you think are most important to be able to have a discussion where it's not just a shouting match at each other back and forth? Or is that a human problem instead of a technology problem?
If I could go back, this will be a controversial choice. I would go back to RPGNet before the heavy moderation started. Because before then, I think everyone knew what the game was, and the fight was limited to the forums, and you could disagree, and you could have a really boisterous, knockdown, drag-out argument, and it wouldn't get you banned, might get you a suspension or something. And you could have your airing of grievances and your differences, and that was fine. And it was contained. So if you could have the ease of access that we have now with social media, combined with the kind of more limited scope that you get, that you used to get on forums, I think that would be the perfect thing. But the thing is, on social media, even if you go into groups or whatever, they're all monitored, and they're going to be increasingly monitored by AI, or some tattletale is going to go off and tell
screenshot
to Uncle Elon or whatever, and then you're screwed, and it's often stripped of all context or preamble or whatever else is going on. But I don't think that toothpaste is going back in the tube. I think we have to learn to adapt to it, just like we did with the printing press and email and forums and Usenet groups and whatever else. Etiquette and so on emerges. It's just whether we're being given the time and space to develop the new social tools. The printing press was a huge one, because people were so used to the only books and writing they ever encountered was the Bible, and that was true, absolutely true. So they got a pamphlet from some ranter, leveler, or digger, and they took, because it was the printed word, they took it as the gospel truth, and it took a while for people to come around to figuring out that not everything that's written down is necessarily the word of God.
I had a conversation with somebody on X recently, just a brief exchange, and they were saying that with the rise of AI and how much it's improved every couple months, how much it's improved, they were like, it's going to be really, really difficult for people to trust issues are going to become huge, because what can you believe when you can't? The things you've always assumed were true by looking at it, you can't assume are true anymore. And one of the things I said was that I kind of half hope that drives the next generation more towards in person, to where they prefer to be in person, because that is 100% believable, versus a virtual space where virtual has always been able to be manipulated. But at this point now, it's to a point where it's beyond what any of us probably ever dreamed of as we were kids.
It's I find it both scary and interesting. I don't come down on any particular side on the AI argument, because I can see both sides, and every time an evangelist, either for or against, comes at me, I move in the opposite direction. So.
I've got zero issue with it. I can see where both sides are coming from. I view most of the anti-AI crowd tends to be operating from a place of self-preservation rather than just looking at it as hey, that's cool tech. They OpenAI just the other day released a whole series of new videos of demoing that 4.0, I believe they're calling it.
The voice one.
Yeah, and that was spooky impressive. I don't know how much of that was, this was the cherry picked best of the crop to do on a demo, and how much that'll reflect in the real world. But it was scary impressive, and when you realize that's the worst it will ever be from now on, it's pretty crazy.
I mean, I would hope that these changes encourage people to think more critically, and maybe learn to value what the Japanese call wabi-sabi, the sort of perfection of imperfection of human created stuff. I would hope it would be that way, but then you go over to Facebook, and people are just believing bad AI images of giant crocheted cats and whatever else, and you just think, oh, there's no hope for the human race, is there?
When people get real upset online, and it's been for ages, and it's not just online, this has happened long before social media came, but now it's much easier to spread. Do you believe that there's a separation between art and artist? So if somebody has an issue, whether it's legitimate or not, against an artist, should the art suffer, or should the art be looked at as, hey, this is either good or bad, we don't care who created it?
I think there should be a separation, but there often isn't, because someone is now associated with bad thing. So if you like something bad person created, you must agree with them on bad thing. This is probably most apparent with J.K. Rowling. I think she's become such a massively polarizing figure, and all these people who were so into her work are now. It's like a bad breakup. You're so in love with this person, and then you hate them and everything they stand for, and you get kind of emotional whiplash. I think there should be division. For me, what I try to do is I try to sit down and have a think. Okay, I like this person's work. Do I like it enough to ignore everything else that they've done? By supporting them, am I actually supporting something bad, or am I just enjoying something? Take Orson Scott Card, for example.
I was actually going to. I love Ender's Game. I think the guy's a complete nut.
I love Speaker for the Dead.
Yeah, Ender's Game gets mentioned a lot. I think I actually like Ender's Shadow more than Ender's Game, but Speaker of the Dead is also very good.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I like his work, and I've read a lot of it in the past, but he spent a lot of money opposing LGBT favorable representation laws in California and so on. And so I decided I'm not going to buy anything of his anymore, because he's actively putting the money he earns into something that I disagree with. So I just buy it secondhand. And that'll do. So I don't need to worry about it anymore. I can still enjoy the books and the ideas that he presents in his fiction while disagreeing with the man. Similarly, another science fiction author, Peter F. Hamilton, he's very conservative, but his ideas are fantastic, and he hasn't really thrown his money into anything horrible, so I have no compunction about buying his books and reading them. So
what's your view on, kind of on the same line, if somebody was to say, I want to check out this game, but I don't want to support that person, or if I want to check out this book and I don't want to support that person, or film, or insert any media that's easily digitized, and somebody just turning around saying, I'm going to pirate it. I know that's tricky for somebody who makes their living from it, but that's kind of why I wanted to ask you it.
Well, I have a complex relationship with piracy. I mean, going going way back, like I remember the video nasty bans that were here in the UK. So the only way you could see certain films and things was if you got a bootleg VHS. So that kind of creates a whole different character on it. I've also found that people pirate my stuff, but I have this steady trickle of people who say, "Oh, I pirated these things by you," and then I decided to buy a copy because I liked it. And so that's like a form of free advertising. And because I'm such a small company, I'm not missing out on a huge amount of money, and my stuff is being seen by more people who then might be interested in more stuff in the future. I thought it was a tragedy when the Trove disappeared, because that was such an important archive of historical RPG material. Yeah, there was piracy going on, but to me, the cost was worth it, because we were preserving old out of print games, and that was I was not happy when that happened.
Yeah, I didn't make huge use of the Trove, but I think I could be wrong, but I think that was probably one of the first places I ever saw White Dwarf magazine, like the old White Dwarfs before they became just a
pre 100s.
Yeah.
1990 White Dwarf 100. That's when it happened.
Yeah, and I think that site is probably the first place I ever saw it. Somebody mentioned it to me and linked me to it there, and just being able to go and see, and something that there was no way I would ever find a physical copy of that near where I live. So it was really neat to see something like that. Outside of gaming, taking gaming and literature off the table, what is something in your life that's joyous? Like what is another hobby, or just something in general that puts a smile on Grim Jim's face, and it makes it not Grim Jim but Smile Jim, or what have you?
Cats. I do. I have 3 cats. Love them to bits, and spending time with them every day is a good source of joy. And I live in the countryside, and I complain about it a lot because it's difficult to get decent internet sometimes, and you're far away from anything, but it's also a beautiful place to live.
So what for those who have a BBC special image of what the countryside is in the UK versus, say, the countryside in America, what is outside of your home that's what is that scene? Paint the picture for us.
Okay. Well, my grandfather built my house that I live in now, so I was lucky enough to inherit it. Property ownership is a huge thing here in the UK. Land ownership, more and more out of reach of people, but still. And I've got 3 apple trees in my yard. I live next door to the village's vicarage, so where the local priest lives or used to live. So there's an old ancient wall running across between our properties. Opposite me, there are some old almshouses which were originally built to house like the local village poor and so on, before there was any sort of welfare system, and an ancient barn / bakery, or it used to be, that dates all the way back to 1066 when the Normans invaded. So I'm just surrounded by history. There's a chalk stream that runs through the village. Like my area of the country has something like 90% of the chalk streams anywhere in the world is all in southern UK, and that's incredibly pure water. Wild watercress grows there, and the water has to be really clean for that to happen. It's woodland up on the hills. We've got slow rolling chalk downs. Blue butterflies are common on chalk downs. That's another sort of rare place. Got an old Norman church with a Crusader tomb in it.
Oh, that's
yeah, and there's an ancient yew tree at the front of it that looks like Yoda should be camped out in it. It's that's the thing about England. There's so much history everywhere. you look, like if I go for a walk, on the chalk downs, you're almost certain to run into an old Stone Age arrowhead, or a fossilized shark's tooth, or a fossilized sea anemone. Yeah, because this all used to be on the seabed. So yeah, there's just stuff everywhere. Proper Tolkien country.
So when you go out for a stroll and you're seeing this, is that kind of like a constant inspiration ticker going on in the head, or is it now where you've lived here your entire life, and even though you just waxed on very elegantly about it, does it become almost like a jaded thing for you, where you're like, I've seen all this my entire life, and it's here?
Well, it's always different, and the landscape is always changing, and the makeup of the people in villages is always changing. Like there's not as much farm work anymore. It's more like a dormer village for commuters who go up to London or one of the other cities to work. A lot of second homes now, a lot of development, because there's so much pressure on housing here in the UK at the moment. So it's something different every time. Like a couple of years back, the blacksmith that used to be there for like hundreds of years closed down, and that got turned into a little cluster of houses. So it's a constant change with the seasons and development and so on over time. I mean, personally, my aesthetic is much more towards sort of horror, science fiction, right, that sort of thing. But growing up, certainly being in this landscape and reading The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and listening to the BBC radio play of Lord of the Rings, while sat in the woods in a clearing surrounded by wildflowers and whatever, it makes an impression on you. I don't think I'd want to live anywhere else.
I want to get over to visit. So my family's been in Canada for ever, long before Canada was Canada. But originally, my ancestry would go back to somewhere near like Plymouth, Exeter area, somewhere in around there, is where they migrated from over to here. But yeah, I've always wanted to go back over and just kind of go and see if I could find some places that we had a family historian that went and mapped everything back and found the village as far back as she could find that we were from. I'd like to go over and see that, because while there is history and everything here, that we're, relatively speaking, we're young countries, Canada and the US, right? So yeah, the density and like the population density and the history is just not the same. So it's really interesting when I can hear somebody who's appreciating what they've got underneath their feet. and I think that's why so many people look at, besides, Tolkien inspirations, obviously, but I think it's part of the reason why both the tourism and the fantasy element always seems to lean towards, UK, European, historical, twisting on things, is because if you really wanted to, you can still go see real castles that real people live in.
Yeah.
And that's what I think. So
yeah. And even older things, Iron Age hill forts. There's Danebury that's not that far from us, where they kind of resisted the Romans for a while, and you can go and see these old Iron Age fortifications and so on. And went on school trips to that and things. I've been to almost every Neolithic stone circle or menhir in the south of the UK at one point or another. That was my sort of ambition, was to visit everyone. So, yeah, there's a lot here.
So you've put out a great body of work. You've been all over the internet in terms of whether it be forums or YouTube videos or in this case podcasts. Lots of people know who you are, some for better, some for worse. If they were going to eventually make a movie based on your life, who's playing you, and what would the movie rating be? So
I would hope it would be R, but probably not. Who would play me? I get told I look like certain people. So Dave Grohl quite often, Dave Windorf as well, Rob Zombie when I'm having a bad hair day. If he was younger, Michael Wincott could probably play me. I always fancied myself as Top Dollar from the original Crow. You know, he had style. That's the rating. Oh, I don't know, 15 maybe. So some adult situations.
In all the commentary around you, I've had people message me. I had put out a list of the folks that I've when I relaunched the podcast here this year of folks that I was planning on speaking with or that I've already spoken with, and I got messages from all areas of like, you should definitely talk to him. That's awesome. And then also, you realize who you're going to go talk to, right? And I was like, yeah, I know who. I wouldn't have invited people I didn't know who I was talking to, but sure, thank you for the warning. What's the most misunderstood thing about you that people who don't take the time to know you aren't understanding? So if there was a message that you could be like, hey guys, just so you know, this is something that you should know about me, that they're not.
So, well, I don't think these people do know me very well. Everyone seems to be going on rumors. So the primary thing I would say would be talk to me yourself before you come up with any conclusions. But otherwise, you can defend someone's right to say or do something, to think something, whatever, and also disagree vehemently with what they actually say or do or whatever. And I'm often mistaken for standing up for the specifics of what someone is saying or doing rather than the principle of what they're saying or doing. So I believe very strongly in the right to free speech and free expression, but that doesn't mean that I agree with or support anything that anyone says, you know. And I think that is the cause of confusion for a lot of people. They seem to mistake my defense of what Neil Gaiman once called icky speech with me actually holding that belief or that position, and I'm not. I just think people have to be allowed to have their own thoughts freely and to express them, even if they're repugnant, until they cross the line into actually being a danger to life and limb. That's where I draw the line, the harm principle.
Yeah, being able to, the difference between shouting fire outside or shouting fire in a place where people are going to stampede because of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get that, and I think that's important in terms of, you know, differentiating the fact that somebody can have a principle, but not necessarily always like how that principle is implemented. But still supporting the fact that, yeah, well, that's the good comes with the bad if you're going to be a principled person.
And you have to believe that the good outweighs the bad. I guess the other thing I would say is that I'm pretty much open to talk to anybody. So if you want to know something, come and get it from the horse's mouth. I'm not going to bite your head off.
What, outside of them coming to talk to you about any controversial item that they might think or have heard, where else can they find you though for the projects that you've got coming up? Or is there any cool projects that you've got coming up that we should all know about? Is there anything in the works that will be coming out soon or anything like that?
So with the people I work with on Tabletopless, we're going to be starting Safe for Work streams as well soon. And we'll be working on a game together. So you'll be able to see that being developed as we play it and as we go along. So that'll be new and different. I don't know exactly where we're going to be showing that yet, but if you keep an eye on my socials, you'll spot that. I'm also working on a game called Ronin, which is not a retro clone, but a retro mutant of Bushido, with some modernized rules and things to go with it. It was originally just going to be a retro clone of Bushido, but then I found out that they do actually still print and publish that. So I didn't want to tread on their toes. So I went back and made some changes and differences to it. Otherwise, I've had a rough few years health-wise and so on. So I've been taking things a little easier this year. So a lot of YouTube videos, because that's fun for me more than it's work. So you can find that at Postmortem Video. And I also stream games every other week on a separate channel called Grim Streams, which you can find. I mean, I'm doing a project to play everything in my shelves at least once.
That's okay. So you've been in this for way longer than I have, and I look over at my shelf at the amount of games I've purchased, and are just sitting there that may never get played. So I have to only imagine that somebody who's been doing it for a lot longer than I have, that must be a huge project of items on the shelf then.
Yeah. I mean, you do have multiple books for the same game, which helps a little. But I have been buying or being sent books at a faster rate than I've been able to review them. so that's a bit difficult. But it's getting there. It's getting there.
We didn't really mention at all about your YouTube channel, but that is something that is impressive, at least from my perspective, because I'm super basic on everything I do. But the production values you put in, even to your very small clip videos, are always very interesting. Is that something that was just something that you started messing around with because it was fun, or did you have any sort of a background in After Effects, whatever it is that you're using for these? Like what?
So, okay, I originally wanted to be an artist and I wanted to work in comics. Glad I didn't now, looking at the state of comics. But boy, I can pick niche industries, can't I? But I had a really bad experience at high school with art, because it was very traditionalist and weren't interested in what I was interested in. I had a really good experience at college. College here is different to university. Mm-hmm. It's like 2 years. Then I went to art school and dropped out after a year. So all the best people are art school dropouts. But at college and during that year in university, I did design and I did some video work. But back then that was video cameras and like reel to reel and things like that. But I enjoyed it. I did a little bit of animation and things. And so I've got that grounding in the visual medium. And then when I started doing YouTube videos, I just found I enjoyed it. And I gradually sort of upgraded the software. So I use Filmora mostly now. It's a nice sort of intermediate system. It's not as full on as some of the dedicated video editing things, but it's robust enough for what I want to do. And then it's just doing it. So I got no formal training or anything. I just kind of taught myself as I went along and sort of felt out my aesthetic. And yeah, I think anyone can. It's just the time, like anything.
Right. You get enough hours in and it starts to look good. And
yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So thank you very much for coming on.
You're welcome.
All right, folks. So that's going to wrap up this episode of the Red Caps podcast. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you are eager to come back for more. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you very so much for listening. And remember, never let your caps dry out. Stay safe, have fun. We'll talk again soon. Take care.